Before we begin this journey together, under the quiet hush of your surroundings, I gently invite you to take a slow and steady breath that stretches softly across your chest like the opening of a wide ocean. And as that breath releases effortlessly into stillness, I welcome you to ease into this space where stories move like the tide and memory floats gently on calm waters. And if this tranquil voyage brings you even the smallest sense of peace, I warmly encourage you to subscribe to this channel, to softly press the like button, and to share this video with someone who might find comfort in these drifting words. And if your heart feels moved, leave a comment below, telling us from where in the world you're listening, and what time of day or night our stories have found you. Now that the invitation has opened the door, I invite you to step slowly into the quiet rhythm of the past, allowing your mind to release its tension and your breath to settle into a slower, gentler pace. Like a candle flickering in the calm of a windless night, with no rush, no pressure, only a soft curiosity, blooming like the first light before dawn, the light that does not push away the dark, but tenderly reveals what has always been there. We do not begin this journey with grand announcements or loud proclamations, but with reverence and hush, with a shared understanding that the most profound stories do not arrive shouting, but instead slip into our awareness like the soft trickle of water over smooth stone, slowly, tenderly, with patience and presence. This is a moment not for conclusion, but for companionship, for the simple and steady act of listening. Let the story of Christopher Columbus arrive, not as a roar from across the centuries, but as a quiet presence that gently takes its seat beside you in the warmth of your breath, in the softness of your stillness, and as the candlelight of long-forgotten times begins to glow gently around us, we do not rush to uncover it, but instead breathe with it, allow it to unfold like parchment warmed by patient hands. Imagine the world as it once was during the 15th century, where the boundaries of known land melted into myth, and the ocean was not merely water, but mystery incarnate, with edges unmarked and stories untested where coastlines whispered secrets and maps bore dragons and strange inscriptions of the great unknown. And in this tender uncertainty was born a child with dreams too wide for the narrow streets of his city. The sea for this child was not simply a path nor a barrier, but a voice, a companion, an unending question. And even from the earliest days, as he wandered between market stalls and the murmurs of sailors in Genoa, there was a quiet stirring within him, an echo of something vast, calling out softly beyond the blue horizon, something wordless yet persistent, something sacred in its wonder. This story is not a celebration of conquest, nor a defense of legacy, but a slow meditation on longing, on waiting, on the silent hopes of one who looked west, not for glory, but for answers to questions he could barely name. It is about the hush before decision, the solitude between inspiration and action, the gentle hunger for something more spacious than what the world had drawn on its charts. As we tell this tale, we will not raise our voices to match the roar of storms or the clash of belief, but instead, we will lower them to match the rhythm of your own calm breath, your own slow heartbeat. And in this rhythm, we will find the current of something ancient and deeply human, the ache to know what lies just beyond the edge of our certainty. Each chapter of this journey will unfold like a petal on still water, gently, carefully, each one held in its own stillness, each one offering not answers, but echoes from the past. And as we move from childhood dreams to royal courts, from windswept harbors to quiet prayers, we travel not as tourists, but as companions willing to listen, to feel, to rest within the softness of history. Perhaps as you listen, you'll feel your thoughts drift slowly, like ships leaving port, unhurried and open. Perhaps you'll forget where you are. And that too is welcome, for this story is not a puzzle to be solved, but a tide to be carried by. And whether you remain alert or drift into dreams, you are exactly where you need to be held by words spoken slowly with care. Discovery does not always happen with a shout. Sometimes it happens with silence, with patience, with a soul willing to sit long enough beside a question until the answer rises like a star over water. And in this story, we meet not only Columbus, the figure, But Columbus the seeker, the listener, the one who dared to let the world remain unknown for just long enough to believe in it differently. So allow your shoulders to soften, your breath to deepen, your mind to rest, and picture yourself not in the noise of history, but in the hush of its quiet moments, standing barefoot beside the sea, watching the sky change color, wondering what lies beyond the furthest point. You can see, knowing only that something waits, something kind and vast, and not yet touched by certainty. There is no need to follow every fact or remember each name, for this is not a lesson, but a lullaby, a way of holding memory with warmth. Instead of weight, a way of letting the past drift to you like a bottle on the tide, carrying not urgency, but invitation, an invitation to wonder, to listen, to be still. This journey is also yours, a shared current between hearts that have never met and yet find themselves together in this quiet. Now, and as you listen, you do more than learn, you accompany. You receive, and you join a circle of those who believe that every story has its place in the hush of the night. So breathe again slowly, as if drawing in the scent of salt and dusk and wood, and with each breath let yourself move further into the calm, letting the noise of the day slip away. As we begin to step into the world of Columbus, not with certainty, but with openness, not to declare, but to discover, not to conquer, but to float. And now we begin with stillness, with breath, with a slow turning of the soul toward the west into the night, where sails rise like prayers, and the wind becomes a voice, and history softens into story. In the heart of Genoa, where stone buildings clung tightly to the rising hills and alleyways twisted like narrow rivers of stone, there was born a child whose name would echo across oceans and through time, not because of the crown he wore or the treasures he held, but because of the questions he dared to carry in his heart. From a young age, Christopher listened to the murmurs of sailors who passed through the busy harbors, their voices thick with salt and legend, and he watched the sails that fluttered like wings over water, each one disappearing into the horizon with stories untold and dreams left hanging in the air like the scent of brine and wood smoke. His family was of modest means, weavers by trade, rooted in a city bustling with trade and tension, and the rhythm of commerce filled the streets with the clamor of carts and the lilt of distant dialects. Yet, even among the crowded energy of Genoa, Christopher often withdrew into quiet thoughtfulness, a stillness unusual in a boy his age, as though he were already peering beyond the stone walls of his world into something more expansive, something softened by mist and mystery. He would spend hours watching ships unload their cargo from distant lands, and in the worn faces of sailors he glimpsed truths that no classroom could offer, truths of longing, of endurance, of risk taken, not for glory, but for the hope of discovery. And when he walked the docks, it was not just to touch the ropes or feel the wood beneath his feet, it was to listen to the silent stories carried in every creak of the hull and ripple of the tide. At night, when the city dimmed and the voices softened, Christopher would climb quietly onto the family roof to gaze at the stars, the same stars that guided sailors over endless black water, and he traced their ancient patterns with his fingers, not to name them, but to feel them, to imagine them as threads that connected Genoa to the great unknown, as if each flicker of light whispered a direction, a secret only the patient could hear. Though he lacked formal education and was not born into privilege, his curiosity became his compass, and in every book he could borrow and every conversation he could overhear, he gathered fragments of knowledge like driftwood on a beach, shaping them slowly into something more personal, more alive, a vision not yet clear, but deeply felt in his bones. The voices of teachers did not move him as much as the scent of the wind that blew in from the harbor, or the sudden hush that fell over the city just before a storm. And in those sensory moments, he found a different kind of learning, one born of listening, of feeling, of trusting what stirred within, rather than what was declared aloud. And it is in this way that his inner world began to stretch outward, one gentle breath at a time. Even as a child, Christopher sensed that the world was not flat nor neatly bounded, but curved and endless and wrapped in the same mystery that lulled him to sleep at night and he did not fear that unknown he welcomed. It not because he was brave, but because he was quiet enough to feel its invitation to hear. The sea's pull not as a danger, but as a promise. As the years passed and his body grew taller, his heart seemed to grow wider to hold. More longing, more tenderness, more questions. He did not yet know how to ask, and when he helped his father with the family trade, winding thread and dyeing cloth, his hands worked with care, but his mind drifted, always to the maps he had seen, and the stories he imagined waiting just beyond their edges. In the city's churches he found another kind of quiet, a solemn hush that echoed through marble columns and painted domes, and as the candles flickered and prayers floated upward, he often wondered if perhaps the divine was not only found in temples, but in the hush of the sea, the turning of stars, the echo of a wave meeting a distant shore. There were moments when he felt out of place among other boys who laughed and brawled with easy confidence, while Christopher listened more than he spoke, watched more than he moved, and in that stillness he began to carry something vast and luminous, inside a dream not yet fully formed, but already growing roots in his soul. He began to ask questions not just of geography or trade, but of meaning, of purpose, of whether one could live a life, not only defined by birth or circumstance, but by the quiet courage to follow an unseen path, and he wondered if the world was waiting, not just for those with power, but for those with patience, for those willing to sit at the water's edge and listen. By the time he reached adolescence, his desire to travel had deepened not into restlessness, but into devotion, and he imagined himself not as a hero or a conqueror, but as a student of the sea, someone who might come to know its moods and music, its lessons whispered through wind and foam and spray. It was said that as a teenager, he took to the sea for the first time, not with fanfare or celebration, but with a quiet nod to his own destiny, his feet stepping onto wood worn smooth by countless others who had dared to trust the water to carry them somewhere new, and in that simple step his life began to change, not suddenly, but slowly, like a tide turning at dusk. He learned to tie knots and read the wind, to navigate not just by stars, but by feel, by instinct, and he became not only stronger in body, but softer in heart, for the sea does not favor arrogance. It asks for surrender, for humility, and Christopher began to understand that the ocean offered no certainty, only invitation, only wonder. And so in the stillness of those early years, long before crowns and commissions and royal courts, there was only a boy listening to the wind, watching the stars, walking narrow streets with a heart full of oceans and dreams. And it was in that boy, not shaped by history, that the voyage began. In the quiet unfolding of Christopher's young adulthood, the whisper of the sea became a voice more urgent, more insistent, not one of noise or command, but of patient invitation, the kind of pull that emerges not from ambition, but from a deep yearning that words fail to fully describe. It was a call not to escape, but to discover, not to prove, but to listen, and again and again. His thoughts turned westward toward the uncharted, the unknown, the vast canvas of water that called him as surely as the stars call the sky. And as he surrendered to this internal murmur, he found that the world around him began to shift, not through movement, but through awareness, through the delicate alignment of his inner longing with the breath of the earth. As he walked the streets of Lisbon, where he had come to deepen his knowledge of maps and navigation, his eyes found their way, not just across parchment and ink, but beyond them into the places where maps ended, where blank space began, where imagination and hope filled in what the hand could not draw. And he lingered at docks and shipyards, absorbing stories, absorbing silence, watching the weary faces of those who had ventured and returned, and those who had vanished into the blue beyond. And in the patterns of tide and rigging, he sensed rhythms of life and learning no book could teach. He read not with haste, but with reverence, the works of Ptolemy, the travels of Marco Polo, the scriptures and fragments that hinted at lands unseen, at people unknown, and within those faded lines he felt a confirmation, not a plan fully formed, but a truth long sensed, a truth that there was more, and that this more was not merely geographical, but spiritual, that there was something sacred in the act of seeking, and that the seeker himself was reshaped by the direction of his gaze, softened by the hope of what he might encounter. Evenings were often spent under stars, as he stood alone by the edge of water, letting the wind cool his face and the spray brush his cheeks, and in those moments he did not ask for clarity or assurance, but simply opened himself to possibility, to the rhythm of waves, to the breath of night. And in this surrender, the vision became stronger, not sharper, but deeper, and his heart began to dream in silence, cradled by the gentle lull of the tide and the silence between constellations. He began to speak gently of his thoughts to trusted companions, not with arrogance or fire, but with the humility of one who knows he walks on thin ice, across time, across belief, and some scoffed, some doubted, but others listened in stillness, drawn not to a proposal, but to the quiet conviction that carried it forth. When someone speaks not to persuade, but to share something ancient and trembling within the soul, people sense it, they feel it, and in the quiet rooms where his ideas were met with ridicule, or with pause, Christopher remained rooted like a tree, trusting the wind would shift in time. His belief that one could reach the east by sailing west was not merely cartographic. It was mystical, born of a trust that the world, though vast, was also whole, that the oceans were not obstacles but bridges, not barriers but paths. And this idea, though doubted by many, grew slowly in him like a seed warmed by patient hands until it became part of his breath, part of his very presence. And in the solitude of his reflection, it took root like the steady opening of petals in the shadow of dawn. He imagined not just land, but culture, not just goods, but people, their languages, their customs, their prayers, and he felt not a lust for conquest, but a curiosity, rooted in reverence in the possibility of communion, of dialogue, of encountering what had been hidden, not to possess it, but to understand it. And in this vision, there was beauty, there was ache, there was longing without name, and it lingered like incense in the chapel of his thoughts. He faced rejection again and again, kings and courts dismissing his proposals, advisors calling him mad or misguided or merely naive, and still he walked slowly forward, each refusal like a stone in his shoe, but never enough to turn him back. He understood that the tides of favor shift slowly, and that sometimes truth must be carried long and alone before it is received. And in that long carrying, he learned to move not in bitterness, but in quiet reverence for the dream itself. And so he refined his words and straightened his maps, and rehearsed again the unfolding of his dream until it no longer needed to be rehearsed, because it lived in his silence in the way. His eyes paused over the horizon, or how his breath slowed near the scent of salt, and as he waited, he did not grow bitter, he grew still more open, more patient, more attuned to the quiet faith within, and to the rhythm of patience that time teaches in silence. There were days when doubt crept in like fog, and he wondered if perhaps the dream was too large, too distant. But he did not fight the doubt, he sat with it, listened to it, and found within it the deepening of his resolve, for dreams do not always burn brightly sometimes. They glow softly, and in their gentleness they endure, and like the moon reflected in still water they light the way without demanding to be held. He listened to the sound of shipbuilders' hammers, echoing across Lisbon's harbors, and each strike felt like a heartbeat, each one carrying the rhythm of a world being built, of voyages becoming real, not in the grand declarations of kings, but in the quiet persistence of those who believe in something more. And as he traced his hand over wood and hull and rope, he felt history being made not loudly, but gently. As he grew older, his conviction did not harden. It softened, it became less about being right, and more about being ready. Ready to wonder. And in this readiness, there was peace not without fear, but beyond it, as though fear had simply become another companion on the journey. Another voice whispering that the unknown was indeed worth knowing, and that silence itself could be a guide. He spent long hours in monasteries, not just to pray, but to think, to read, to dream, and in those stone walls, where voices carried like echoes from the soul, he often found the stillness he needed to remember why he waited, why he endured not for fame, but for faith, for a sense that life could stretch further than borders drawn by kings or pages written by men. And in those sanctuaries, he felt time slow to the rhythm of breath and candlelight. And so, in that long waiting, in that sacred in-between of vision and voyage, Christopher became more than a man with an idea. He became a man in communion with the mystery, a man whose steps, however small, were carried by winds. Older than time, and in his silence, we begin to hear the true beginning of the voyage, not with sails, but with stillness, not with commands, but with breath, and in this breath the map began to unfurl, not upon paper, but within the quiet space of the soul. When the silence of hope had matured into a quiet, steady resolve, Christopher turned his steps toward Castile with the weight of years of dreaming, folded within him like a sail waiting for wind. He did not arrive with grand entourages or noble sponsors, but with worn maps tucked into his satchel and a spirit tempered by rejection, yet unbroken by it. As he crossed the dusty plains of Spain, he found the rhythm of his footsteps aligning with the slow heartbeat of destiny. One beat for each mile, one breath, for each hesitation swallowed by faith. The court of Castile was a world unto itself, wrapped in formality and protocol, adorned with the brilliance of power and the tension of politics. Queen Isabella and King Ferdinand sat at the heart of this complex tapestry, surrounded by advisors, emissaries, generals, and clerics, each voice competing for favor, for influence, for the ear of the crown. And into this symphony of ambition stepped a man with a dream not of conquest, but of course, not of war, but of water. And his simplicity made him stand out like a whisper in a room full of noise. He did not dazzle with oration, nor dominate with authority. He spoke with stillness, with quiet wonder, offering not promises, but possibility. He laid before the court his belief that the Indies could be reached by sailing west a path across the ocean vast and mysterious. And though he was not the first to imagine such a route, he was perhaps the first to feel it as a calling, not just a calculation, and his words carried that weight, that reverence. Many around the court dismissed him not because his idea lacked boldness, but because it lacked lineage. He was no prince, no admiral of pedigree. His maps were unconventional. His estimates doubted, his experience questioned, and yet he returned, not once, but again and again, making the long journey across Spain with patient persistence, bearing letters of introduction, seeking new ears willing to listen, and in the spaces between audience and answer, he waited not in idleness, but in prayer, in study, in silence. He stayed in the monastery of La Rabida during these years, a place of stone and sea, perched above the Atlantic, where monks spoke less and listened more, where the wind carried not just salt but secrets, and where Christopher found rest, not only for his body, but for his doubt. It was there he met friars who believed in him, who saw in his eyes the steady glow of vision. Not fire, but embers, the kind that last, the kind that warm rather than burn. The queen herself was hesitant, not out of cruelty, but responsibility. She bore the burden of a kingdom, still raw from war, from the reconquest of Granada, from debts and famine and uncertainty. And yet she also bore a heart attuned to faith, to exploration, to the sacred duty of possibility. And so she listened not once, but over years, and each time Christopher returned, he brought with him not just maps, but trust, a growing chorus of quiet believers. He endured trials of ego and poverty, living at times on the edge of despair, yet never surrendering the essence of his dream. He watched ships sail without him, watched other men be chosen for lesser tasks, and he learned to wait with grace, to endure with reverence, for he understood that some dreams are given not to be rushed, but to be ripened by time, and touched only when the soul is ready to carry their weight. When finally the answer came, it did not come with trumpet or parade, but with parchment, with signature, with promise. The Catholic monarchs agreed to support his voyage, granting him ships and title, and above all faith, and in That moment a new chapter opened not loudly, but inwardly in the still places of his being, where prayer meets breath and breath meets destiny. He did not celebrate with indulgence. Instead, he knelt in the chapel and let tears fall, not from pride, but from awe, from the humbling knowing that the door had opened not by force but by grace. And he felt in that silence the turning of the tide, not of water, but of time, and he offered his gratitude, not in speech, but in stillness. The ships would be prepared, and the men gathered and the supplies loaded, but that would come later, for now there was only a quiet moment of completion, the kind that comes not when a dream is finished, but when it is blessed. And so he stood at the threshold of voyage, with wind already beginning to stir, and the west calling not with words, but with wonder. He had learned that not all battles are fought with swords. Some are endured with silence, some are waged within, and some are won by waiting. And in this long waiting, he had become something more than a dreamer. He had become a vessel of patience, a mirror of the sea that called him. The court that once seemed cold and closed became a place of opening, a space of listening and reflection where the whisper of the impossible was finally given breath. And as he stepped through the halls where decisions had turned history, he did not rush or posture, but moved slowly, like one in prayer, like one aware that he was no longer asking for permission, but answering a calling. Every parchment signed, every seal pressed into wax, became more than bureaucracy. They became blessings, affirmations that the sacred silence he had carried was not in vain, and that his breath, his steps, his stillness had been a form of navigation, a map drawn, not on paper, but in patience. He spent quiet days in Seville, preparing, reflecting, walking by the river, where sails would one day fill with wind, and he let the breeze teach him again about direction and surrender, about how one does not control the wind, but listens to it, leans into it, and is carried by it. And in the hush before the voyage, in the days of gathering and readiness, he felt not urgency, but grace, and in that grace he found peace. A peace born not of certainty, but of surrender, not of arrival, but of alignment. And so he waited once more, not with fear, but with reverence. In the quiet stillness of the early morning harbor, the soft glow of dawn settled gently upon the wooden hulls and fluttering sails of ships that waited restlessly in the gentle tide, and among them, nestled near the heart of the port, a small fleet was being readied for a journey, unlike any other, a voyage that would carry men across uncharted waters into realms known only by myth and hope. And at the center of this growing storm of purpose stood Christopher Columbus, observing the preparations with a mixture of awe and solemnity, as if he could already feel the weight of destiny upon his shoulders. And in the hush of morning mist, there was a sense that history itself was quietly inhaling before exhaling into motion. Each detail of the ships was inspected with care by sailors whose hands bore the texture of salt and rope and weather their movements, purposeful yet reverent, as if they too sensed that this expedition was not merely another venture, but something more, something sacred in its uncertainty. The wood creaked and groaned, like living beings stirred from slumber, as ropes were tied, provisions loaded, sails tested, and hulls caressed by gentle hands, and the scent of tar mingled with seaweed and old wine barrels lingered in the air, a perfume of exploration. Within the quarters of the Nina, the Pinta, and the Santa Maria, Columbus would pace slowly, his steps careful, and his eyes drawn to every angle, every map. Every journal, each object he touched, seemed to whisper to him of possibility or peril, and he responded in silence, not with words, but with quiet nods, and the slow measured breath of a man walking a line between conviction and the unknown outside. The bustle of preparations murmured like the early stirring of a storm, far on the horizon, calm, but inevitable. He would pause often to gaze at the sea, and in those moments the wind would play gently with his hair, as if the ocean itself was speaking softly, urging him forward, reminding him of the promises it held and the dangers it kept, like a great living soul that could cradle or consume. And Columbus listened not with his ears, but with his bones, his skin, his dreams as if the deep rhythm of the tides was now beating in time with his own heart. The men chosen for this journey were many and varied, some hardened by years of sailing, others young and wide-eyed, drawn to the call of adventure or coin, and each one carried a silence within them that could not be named, the silence of anticipation, of wondering if they would return or be swallowed by the unknown. And they moved among the crates and barrels. With purpose their laughter subdued their voices, low as if even speech could wake the sleeping gods of the deep. Columbus would pass them and offer no grand speeches, no fiery declarations, only a gaze that lingered, a nod that acknowledged the solemn pact between them, for no man on this journey would be unchanged, and no man would be untouched by the vastness that awaited, and in the quiet of shared labor they found something like peace, something like readiness, even in the shadow of the unknown. Letters were written to families, sealed with trembling hands, and placed into the safe keeping of those who remained behind words, heavy with unspoken fears and fragile hopes that someday they would be read again, by candlelight in quiet rooms or under open skies, and the ink still drying became a bridge between what was known and what might never be again, and the act of writing itself became a soft farewell. In the final days before departure, Columbus would retreat to the chapel, his footsteps echoing on cool stone floors, and there, in the flicker of candlelight, he would bow his head and whisper not requests, but gratitude for the strength to walk into the unknown, for the grace to bear what might come. And in the silence of that sacred space, the shadows danced gently on the walls, like spirits listening, like ancient guardians, holding watch over the unborn journey. The Queen's blessing still rang softly in his ears, not as command, but as benediction, and he carried her words not in pride, but in burden, for with her hope came expectation, and with expectation came weight, and he bore it like a cloak across his shoulders, one that warmed and pressed down in equal measure. And even as he prepared for the voyage, he carried the echoes of courtrooms and coronas, the light and shadow of power and faith entwined. As the final days slipped by, the village around the port took on a hush that was almost reverent, as if the people knew that something sacred and terrifying was about to unfold, and they watched with quiet eyes as strangers passed in and out of taverns and ships, bobbed with restrained urgency, and children played in narrow alleys, unaware that the men they waved to might soon be stories whispered in time, not voices heard again. There were nights when Columbus could not sleep, and he would rise from his quarters and walk the decks, listening to the timbers creak and the ropes strain like sighs from the belly of the ship, and the stars above would blaze with silent fire, and in their constellations he would read not maps but omens, not certainty but wonder, and he would exhale slowly, letting his breath join the rhythm of the sea wind. The moon hung low on the water like a silver coin waiting to be claimed, and Columbus would lean on the railing and watch it shift across the waves, casting pathways that led nowhere and everywhere. And in those moments he did not feel brave or chosen, or even prepared. He felt only the vastness of what lay ahead, and the stillness of knowing that he would go anyway, that he must. And when the final sunrise crept across the harbor, turning the sails golden and the sea to liquid fire, the men stood ready. Their belongings packed, their hearts steady in the trembling, and Columbus looked once more at the shore, not in farewell, but in gratitude for what it had given him, and in curiosity for what the sea would take and give in return. And he nodded once slowly, as if to say, yes to the wind, yes to the water, yes to the journey. The bells rang gently through the morning air, not as alarm, but as invitation, and the ships began to stir, the sails rising like wings, caught in some ancient breath, and the ropes slithered loose like vines pulled from stone. And as the ships drifted from dock to current, there was no cheering, no fanfare, only silence and the long exhale of a world letting go. Columbus stood at the helm, not with clenched fists or fierce command, but with calm fingers resting on the rail, and his eyes not on the horizon, but on the present moment. The sound of the sea against the hull, the scent of salt and wood, the feel of the wind, moving through his thoughts like a song unspoken, and in that stillness the journey had already begun, not with movement, but with acceptance. And thus the ships moved forward, slowly, gently, as if the sea itself was guiding them out of the known and into the dream, and the people on shore grew smaller, not just in distance, but in memory. And what remained was only the sound of the waves, the rustle of sails, the breath of men, and the silent unfolding of a voyage that had waited lifetimes to begin. The first days upon the ocean were marked by a stillness that reached deeper than silence, a kind of quiet that seemed to rise from the sea itself, wrapping the ships in a cocoon of vastness, and calmed the creaking of the timbers, and the rhythmic sound of waves against the hull were like ancient lullabies sung by the earth itself, their tones low and endless, and soothing to the heart in this floating world of canvas and salt. The crew moved slowly, their footsteps softened by the constant rocking of the vessel as they adjusted to the slow rhythm of life at sea. Christopher stood often at the bow, his gaze steady upon the horizon, which seemed to stretch without end, a band of pale blue by day and a velvet canopy of stars. By night his eyes searched not for landmarks, but for signs, for whispers from the sky, and see that they were still on course, and still within the favor of the divine. The ocean seemed both endless and intimate, holding secrets in its depths, while mirroring the vastness of thought that expanded within each silent sailor. The wind was their unseen companion, ever shifting, sometimes playful, sometimes firm. It filled the sails with life, or fell still without, warning, inviting long hours of reflection, when the ships floated like dreaming birds upon a glassy mirror. The men sat in silence or exchanged quiet words, stories from home, thoughts of what lay ahead, and even laughter. Softened by distance and the solemn beauty of their surroundings, their lives began to change. Not in sudden ways, but slowly, like the curve of the sun's descent each evening. Meals were shared on deck in simple fashion: dry biscuits, salted meat, a bit of wine, and dried fruits, rationed with care and gratitude. Yet even these humble offerings held the comfort of routine, a reminder that they were still tethered to the earth they had left behind. Each bite chewed slowly became a meditation, an anchor in the gentle chaos of drifting westward into the unknown, where time no longer obeyed the logic of clocks, but followed the sway of the wind and the passage of clouds. In the long hours of sailing, the crew found solace in repetition, tying and retying lines, polishing wood, and caring for sails, duties that became sacred rituals that allowed their minds to wander freely. Some sang quietly to themselves old songs from the ports of Genoa or Andalusia, while others whispered prayers shaped by salt and memory. Christopher, too, performed his rituals unrolling, his charts by lantern light, mapping their course with precision that belied the uncertainty surrounding every decision. Nights on the Atlantic were especially tender moments of reflection and communion with the infinite stars. Above blinked in ancient constellations, their light dancing upon the surface of the sea, each one a silent witness to the voyage. Below, Christopher would walk the deck, barefoot, sometimes letting the rough grain of the wood ground him in the present, while his mind sailed across time, envisioning what lands they might find, not with conquest in heart, but with a reverent curiosity. There was fear, of course, hidden in glances and quieted only by habit. The vastness was both awe-inspiring and terrifying, and there were times when doubt settled like mist on their hearts' questions, unspoken about the wisdom of following this strange vision into nothingness. Yet those moments passed as swiftly as the wind, and were replaced with a deepening trust, not in the stars or in luck, but in the rightness of the path and in each other's strength. Each sunrise brought with it a gentle renewal, golden light spilling across the water, reminding them that the sea was not their enemy, but their teacher. They learned to read its moods, its colors, and patterns the way it rose in swells and rested in calmness. They began to understand the language of the ocean, not as something to master, but something to respect, a living presence that responded to reverence more than command. Christopher kept a steady journal, noting whether the positions of the stars, the progress of the fleet, and his inner thoughts, though most of the entries were factual there. or times when poetry crept in quietly, a line about the way, the moonlight touched the waves, or a comparison between the sails and wings of angels. His words were not only records, they were prayers scattered across pages that he hoped might outlive even the voyage itself. As they ventured further west, the horizon did not change, and that sameness tested their resolve. Some began to see visions in the clouds, or patterns in the waves' omens, both hopeful and strange, and Christopher welcomed such dreams not as madness, but as signs that the human soul responds to mystery with meaning, that imagination fills the silence with what is most needed to go on. The days blended one into the next, a flowing rhythm of breath, wind, and water were names of days and hours. Lost importance, the sea became a great teacher of patience, of humility, of listening rather than acting. And this listening taught the men to hear their own hearts more clearly, some for the first time in their lives, and in this gentle awareness came peace, a sense of being held by something vast and kind. Storms came as well, unannounced, and wild, their winds loud enough to swallow voices, and their rains sharp as knives. The ships groaned but held firm, guided by hands grown wise through repetition and trust. When the storms passed, as they always did, the ocean became even more beautiful, washed clean and glistening, as though it too had been changed by the trial, and offered its forgiveness in stillness. Christopher often spoke to the men not as commander, but as companion, his voice low and slow, reminding them that they sailed not toward riches, but toward something grander, the expansion of the world, the weaving together of lands and peoples through courage and persistence. He asked them to remember that they were writing a story, not just of discovery, but of human spirit enduring and seeking and opening. In the quiet between duties, many of the men began to meditate in their own way. Some gazed at the sky for hours, others traced the edges of old coins or letters from home, small sacred acts that reminded them of their origins and anchored them in longing and hope. The sea did not steal their thoughts, it refined them like wind-smoothed stone, until what remained was essential, clear, and whole. And so they continued into the open sea, not as wanderers, but as pilgrims, sailing toward a horizon that refused to arrive, a moving line between known and unknown that invited not answers, but presence. Each day became not a test, but a gift, a slow unfolding of purpose, carried gently on the breath of wind and the pull of tide, where every creak and splash and silence became part of a greater song. As the voyage stretched farther into the great expanse of the Atlantic Ocean, the world around the fleet began to take on an almost sacred stillness, a hushed anticipation that moved across the water like a gentle breath. The ships floated upon endless blue plains, their sails catching the wind in slow, steady rhythms that soothed the men into a kind of waking dream. The air was rich with salt and possibility, and even the creaking of the wood seemed softer now, as if the ships themselves were listening for something profound and unseen, something that might rise not just from the sea, but from within their own longing. Christopher stood at the bow of the Santa Maria, not as a captain charting a course, but as a pilgrim bearing witness to the mysteries of the ocean. His gaze was fixed not on a destination, but on the meeting place between water and sky, where the horizon shimmered like a veil separating the known from the unknown. His thoughts moved like tides within him, slow and deliberate, and deep-shaped by the steady rocking of the ship and the unspoken prayers of his crew. He watched for signs not as a skeptic, but as a believer, one who understood that revelation often comes in whispers and in waiting. In the early mornings, when the mist still clung to the sails and the sea appeared to sleep, the air carried new scents, subtle and fleeting, but enough to stir the senses of men who had spent weeks surrounded only by the smell of salt and tar. A faint fragrance of earth, of something green and living, teased the edge of perception, and with it came a flicker of hope so quiet it passed between the crew like a shared breath, unspoken but understood. One by one small signs emerged in the water, a branch drifting with tender leaves still clinging to its stem, a worn plank smoothed by time and tide, a clump of seaweed dancing just beneath the surface. These offerings from the ocean were accepted not with noise or celebration, but with reverence. The men gathered silently around each find, touching it gently, as though it were holy proof that the world they imagined was drawing closer. Seabirds appeared in the skies, not as isolated wanderers, but in flocks that moved with intention, circling the ships, then vanishing toward the horizon, their wings glinting in the sun like silver promises. They called out to the sailors in voices more ancient than language, a sound that reminded them of land of trees of stillness. Their cries echoed across the decks, carried by the wind, and tucked into the quiet corners of the men's hearts. Christopher wrote in his journal that the sea had changed, that it now held a warmth, a clarity that had not been there before. He described the sky as speaking in new tones, softer and more welcoming, as if the heavens themselves were leaning closer to the earth. He spoke of signs not as superstition, but as sacred dialogue between nature and those who dared to listen deeply. He wrote, slowly letting each word carry the weight of his devotion to the journey. At twilight, the sea turned to glass, and the sky unfolded in layers of pink and gold. The ships moved forward with the gentleness of a lullaby. Rocked by swells that mirrored the steady breath of the earth, the crew sat in small clusters on deck, some holding keepsakes, others closing their eyes and letting the wind wrap around them like a blanket of memory. In those moments, they were not explorers or sailors or men of ambition. They were children beneath the stars, resting in the arms of something vast and kind. Dreams began to shift among them, no longer filled with visions of gold or triumph, but with simpler longings, a quiet field, a voice calling from home. The scent of fresh bread carried on the breeze. The journey had thinned their desires to essentials, to what could not be bought or named, but only felt the promise of land, became less about what they would find and more about who they might become. Christopher walked among them barefoot and silent, his presence a gentle anchor. He touched shoulders in passing, offered a nod or a wordless smile. He listened not for answers, but for the music of their hearts, for the melodies shaped by fear and hope and surrender. He had become less a leader and more a vessel for the dream itself, the embodiment of trust in the unseen. As the days passed, the line between sky and water grew more intimate, more charged with anticipation. The men began to speak in softer tones, their voices slowed by wonder, and by the weight of what they were nearing. They read the ocean like scripture, deciphering every ripple, every shadow, every bird call as a verse in the unfolding text of destiny. And in doing so, they found peace, a quiet confidence born not of certainty, but of shared devotion to a mystery that chose them. The nights were filled with silence, deep and alive like the space between heartbeats. The constellations above burned more brightly than ever, each star a sentinel watching over the slow progress of wooden ships across the ink-black sea they lay beneath. This ancient sky with open eyes and quiet minds, allowing the darkness to cradle them into stillness, letting their thoughts drift as slowly as the clouds. Some spoke to the sea aloud, offering thanks and questions and fragments of song. Others carved small figures from bits of driftwood, holding them like talismans against their chests. The ocean accepted all, without judgment, without reply, but with a profound steadiness that gave the men courage to trust not in outcome, but in journey, to see the voyage, not as a test to be passed, but as a path to be walked with reverence. As the sun rose again and again, in silent blessing the signs became clearer, the ocean's voice grew softer, yet more sure, the air richer with scent, and sound the sky closer with every breath. The crew no longer asked if they would find land. They knew in their bones that land was already finding them, reaching out across space, and time to meet them in this sacred in-between. And so the men prepared in quiet ways, cleaning decks with new tenderness, adjusting sails with prayerful precision, offering their bodies in service to the dream that carried them. The dream no longer felt like Christopher's alone, but there's something shared and shaped by every hand that had pulled rope, every eye that had scanned the sky, every heart that had dared to hope. They sailed onward not to conquer, but to encounter, not to claim, but to connect. They sailed with open hands, with bowed heads, with hearts that had been softened and strengthened by the immensity of the sea, and by the silence of listening, and by the slow unfurling of faith. They moved not toward a destination, but toward a revelation, carried gently by wind and wonder toward the horizon, where the soul of the earth waited to speak. The dawn that broke o'er the horizon on that fateful morning did not seem ordinary to the men who had waited so long to glimpse the promise of land. The light was softer, more golden, as if the sun itself had slowed its rise to honor the moment. The sea shimmered with a gentler rhythm, and the air smelled less of salt and more of earth. Though no land was yet in sight, the men could feel it in their bones in the stillness that came not from fear, but from reverent awe. They stood along the edges of their ships, with breath held and eyes searching, drawn forward by the call of something sacred and new. The silence between them was not empty, but rich with anticipation and memory, as if the wind itself carried whispers of ancient destinies and unseen shores. The cry of land rang out not like a shout, but like a prayer. It passed from sailor to sailor, not with frenzy, but with trembling wonder, and those who heard it first were silent, their eyes locked on the green sliver breaking the endless blue. A hush fell across the fleet as men turned to one another, and then back again to the miracle unfolding ahead. Their hearts beat slow and wide, full of something deeper than joy, full of a stillness so vast it felt holy. The moment seemed suspended in time, as if the very sea held its breath to witness this sacred threshold. As they drew closer, every detail of the shoreline seemed radiant, the curve of the trees, the way the waves kissed the sand, the flight of unfamiliar birds rising and circling in the dawn sky. Each leaf, each shadow, each breath of wind seemed to whisper welcome, though they did not know the names of what they saw. They recognized its beauty, as if they had always carried it within them, waiting to awaken, and now brought to the surface by the quiet magic of arrival. The colors were brighter, the air thicker, with the scent of life unspoken and untouched. Christopher stood still at the helm, his hands resting lightly on the rail, his eyes wet not with triumph, but with gratitude. He spoke no words, gave no commands. He simply looked, breathed, and allowed the silence to rise around him. He had dreamed of this moment in 1,000 forms, but none matched the stillness he felt. Now the way time paused and wrapped them in quiet, the hum of the ocean and the softness of the breeze seemed to cradle his thoughts in a calm beyond understanding. The men lowered small boats into the sea with movements careful and deliberate. Their hands worked not with urgency, but with reverence, as though they were handling something sacred. They climbed down into the swaying crafts, their eyes never leaving the shore, and began to row slowly, the oars dipping gently into the water with a rhythm. Like a heartbeat or a lullaby, the sound of wood against water was the only music, and it played a song of arrival and humility. As the boats reached the sand, the men stepped onto land, not as conquerors, but as pilgrims, their feet pressed into the earth. With a hesitance that bordered on reverence, some knelt and touched the ground, others stood with eyes closed, letting the breeze wrap around them like an embrace. They felt the difference beneath them, the texture of the soil, the whisper of leaves, the promise of something entirely other, and in that moment the journey transformed into something sacred and quiet and whole. Christopher waited before stepping onto the shore, his thoughts drifting like the sails above him. He had brought them this far, not through certainty, but through faith, not with force, but with quiet conviction. And now he stood at the threshold of the unknown, not to claim but to listen, not to possess but to learn. And so he moved forward, one step at a time, until his feet rested on new ground, feeling the grains of sand give slightly, as if the earth itself were greeting him gently. The trees swayed as if greeting them, and birds called from high branches, weaving song into the morning. The men did not speak much. They walked slowly through the edge of the forest, touching bark, watching the dance of light across leaves, breathing deeply as though the air itself held stories meant only for them. Each step they took was a beginning, a question, a surrender, their hearts open, not to possession, but to presence. They saw figures in the distance dark against the green, and paused not with fear, but with a quiet curiosity and respect. They stood in stillness, waiting, and soon the strangers emerged, not with weapons or cries, but watchful eyes and open posture. Their silence was different, a silence filled with presence and time, the kind of silence that holds room for everything to unfold, and in that space of shared gaze, something ancient stirred a quiet recognition beyond words. The meeting that followed was not loud or fast. It moved like wind through trees, slow and uncertain, yet filled with meaning. The gestures were small, the looks long and deliberate. The space between words was honored more than the words themselves, and in that space something ancient stirred, a connection not born of language, but of shared humanity, a recognition of the sacred in each other. In that soft exchange there was no past or future, only the stillness of the present. The day passed not in events, but in presence, in the simple being near one another, in the air, shared in the earth, underfoot, in the shadows that lengthened. Across unfamiliar ground, as the sun drifted slowly down, the men returned to their ships in twilight, their eyes lingering on the shore, as if leaving behind part of themselves. The land had spoken to them, not in words, but in wonder and in silence that echoed deep within. That night on deck, the sailors did not sing or shout. They whispered and sat close. They watched the stars emerge and traced constellations they had never named. They felt the land behind them, like a soft heartbeat in the dark, its rhythms now woven into their own. They slept not with the tension of the unknown, but with the peace of arrival, and their dreams carried the scent of trees and the hush of sacred soil beneath their feet. Christopher wrote again in his journal, his words slow and heavy with emotion. He spoke not of victory, but of wonder, not of maps or measures, but of moments of faces of the way. The breeze had moved through the trees of the silence shared. Between strangers, he wrote to remember, not what was seen, but what was felt. He recorded not the conquest, but the communion, not the distance traveled, but the nearness found. And in that stillness the voyage transformed, no longer just a journey across water. It had become a journey inward, a search, not just for land, but for understanding, for communion, for the rediscovery of what it means to arrive not with conquest, but with open hands and quiet steps and hearts, humbled by the expanse of all they did not yet know. A sea still stretched behind them, wide and deep, but now it carried a different weight, not the weight of longing, but of grace, not of questions, but of presence. And the horizon ahead, no longer threatened with unknowns, but offered instead the promise of more, to listen to more, to touch more, to witness with hearts softened by wind and salt, and wonder with minds quieted by awe, and souls widened by silence. The first true exchange between the voyagers and the island's inhabitants did not happen in a blaze of activity, but unfolded slowly like a breeze that moves gently through the trees. Before you realize, the air has shifted. The approach was not with trumpets or weapons, but with soft footsteps and curious eyes. The men from the ships and the native people of the island moved toward one another with a quiet that was not born of fear, but of mutual reverence, an unspoken awareness that something profound was taking place between worlds that had never touched. The moment was tender and stretched wide, like the calm surface of the sea under early light, inviting all present to simply be. Christopher stood at the edge of the beach, his feet sunk lightly into the sand as he watched the islanders approach. They came not in force, but in small groups, bare feet padding softly on the earth, with bodies painted in bright colors and adorned with feathers and ornaments that shimmered in the morning light. Their expressions were calm, open, inquisitive. They carried no weapons, only woven baskets, shells and fruit, held with an ease that suggested offering rather than defense. And in their eyes there was not submission, but curiosity, a desire to understand the strangers that had emerged from the sea. The silence between them felt sacred, more profound than any words could have been. Christopher felt his own breath slow, as if the air itself encouraged stillness. The space around them seemed to expand, filled with the scent of flowers and sea salt, the rustling of palm leaves. the distant call of birds, and beneath it all the soft rhythm of waves gently breaking on the shore like a heartbeat. Grounding all who stood there, this silence was not emptiness, but presence, an invitation to witness, to see beyond appearances and into the shared humanity of both sides. A young islander stepped forward slowly, with deliberate grace, holding out a piece of fruit in both hands, his eyes wide and solemn. Christopher received it with a gentle nod, bowing his head slightly. In thanks he offered a small bell in return, its surface catching the sunlight and sending glimmers of light. Between them there was no speech, no translation. Just the shared simplicity of giving and receiving. The exchange held no price, only presence, and the recognition that in this first gift something deeply human had passed between them. Around them, the men of the fleet and the people of the island began to mirror this quiet ceremony. Small gestures extended and received, smiles that spoke without need of sound touches to the shoulder, light and brief, meant only to acknowledge one another's being. The meeting became not an event, but a meditation, a still and sacred communion of human recognition and curiosity, as if the beach itself had become a sacred ground upon which no loud voice could intrude. The colors of the island came alive under the rising sun, flowers of vivid orange and red, birds of iridescent green darting through the trees, fabrics woven in hues unfamiliar and radiant. The men from the ships gazed at the vibrant world with wonder, their eyes wide and lingering on each detail, as though they were seeing the world for the first time. And in many ways, they were each shade, each shape, each scent was a new story waiting to unfold, and the land itself seemed to breathe with gentle hospitality. Christopher watched his crew with quiet attention. He saw how their rigid postures softened, how their movements slowed, how the usual edge of wariness gave way to something rounder, more open. He saw them kneel to admire a woven basket, to laugh quietly when handed a ripe fruit, to sit cross-legged on the sand beside children who offered shells and songs. And in that seeing he too softened, allowing the moment to carry him further from conquest and closer to presence, letting go of maps and crowns and titles for just this hour. There was no shared language between them, but the air was thick with understanding. Laughter came easily, not as reaction, but as resonance, and when someone stumbled or offered a gift, clumsily the others responded, not with judgment, but with joy. The beach became a kind of sanctuary, a circle of living energy woven from newness and stillness. The horizon remained, but the moment held all that mattered. Each sound was gentle, each breath unhurried, each face open. In the background, the waves continued their timeless rhythm, soft and constant, grounding the gathering in a kind of sacred pulse. Christopher sat for a time on the sand, his hand resting on a small carved figurine gifted to him by one of the elders, the wood warm in his palm, the carving unfamiliar but beautiful, the face of the figure looking upward, its eyes wide, as though watching the stars even in daylight, and in holding it, he felt connected not just to the man who carved it, but to the generations who honored such symbols. He turned his gaze to the canopy of trees and the high blue sky above, letting his breath slow. Even more deeply, he felt the pull of his mission, of his titles and maps and promises, back in Castile, yet here under this sky, those pressures felt, distant, muffled by the breath of the forest, and the songs of a land that had never asked to be found. And in the hush, he felt more explorer than emissary, more soul than sailor. The exchanges continued into the afternoon, not hurried, but unfolding like petals. With time, with care, the crews were offered roasted roots, woven cloths, smooth stones of strange color and beauty, and in return they gave beads, bells, combs, and cloths, not in volume, but in thoughtfulness. One to one, hand to hand, a rhythm formed, one of mutual noticing and quiet generosity with each offering, not merely a trade, but a gesture of attention. The sun moved slowly across the sky, casting long shadows across the sand and warm light across every gesture. The glow made everything feel timeless, as though the moment could stretch forever, and no one there wished to break its spell. There was a peace that wrapped around them, not born of safety, but of shared attention. A quiet pact not to harm, to remain open, to listen, and to allow the unknown to unfold without rush. Later, some of the sailors would speak of the dignity of the islanders, of their calm and unhurried way of moving, their readiness to laugh, their rootedness in their land, and their ease with silence. And Christopher would write not of gold or conquest, but of beauty, of gentleness, of the possibility that this was a place where peace lived in the spaces between words, and where stillness was not absence, but presence. As the sun dipped toward the horizon, casting golden light across the rippling sea, Christopher stood again this time beside the islanders and his crew together. He looked out at the ocean, not as a boundary, but as a bridge, and in that light, with the hush of waves behind him and the rustle of leaves beside him, he felt not a rival, but opening, not an end, but a deep breath at the edge of something new, where history might begin, not with a battle, but with a whisper. As the time came to leave the islands behind, the preparations for the return journey unfolded slowly and with a reverence that had not been present in the outward voyage. The men packed their belongings with gentle hands, wrapping keepsakes in cloth and murmuring quietly, as though afraid to disturb the peace that had settled over them. They moved with a certain reluctance, with a silent awareness that this place had changed them in ways they could not yet name. Each motion carried the weight of farewell, and each glance lingered just a moment longer, as if the world they had encountered here was whispering its last blessings into their hearts. Christopher watched the crew move across the shoreline, their figures small against the endless blue of sky and sea, and he felt a quiet ache, not of regret, but of reverence, the kind that surfaces when one leaves behind something sacred, something unexpected and precious. His heart beat with a rhythm shaped by wind and birdsong and the hush of the fawn islands nights, and he wondered if he would ever hear that rhythm again in the world. He once knew his gaze was steady, yet his thoughts wandered deep into places he had not yet named within himself. Each sail was checked, each barrel secured, yet there was no urgency, only intention, every movement deliberate, like a ceremony marking the end of something unspoken. The ship itself seemed changed, less a vessel of conquest and more a vessel of memory. Its wood creaked not with age, but with stories absorbed through salt and silence and time. The ropes held not just the mast, but the invisible threads of moments shared between strangers, who had become something more, something bound by wind, by experience, by wonder. In the final moments before departure, Columbus walked once more to the edge of the forest, where the trees stood like sentinels and the shadows curled around the roots. He placed a hand on the bark of one ancient tree and closed, his eyes breathing deeply, as if to carry the scent of earth and leaf with him across the sea. He said no words, but the stillness answered, as if the land had already said farewell, a farewell not in sound, but in presence, in the quiet rustle of leaves and the embrace of humid air. As they pushed off from shore, the islanders watched with calm eyes, neither sorrowful nor jubilant, but steady and present their presence, a silent benediction carried by the breeze that lifted the sails and stirred the hearts of the men. Christopher stood at the helm, his gaze lingering on the receding shoreline until it blurred with the horizon, and still he stood long after it had vanished, standing as a witness not only to distance, but to change, to the quiet evolution of a soul touched by wonder. Days passed with a softness unfamiliar to their previous journey. The sea no longer felt like an opponent, but a companion, its waves rising and falling in rhythms that echoed the breath of sleep. The crew spoke less, laughed more softly, and spent hours in silence, gazing over the water, as though searching not for land, but for meaning, their silence a kind of prayer, stretched across the water, offering thanks without words. Meals were taken in quiet gratitude, shared with gentle gestures and long pauses, each bite an echo of flavors left behind each sip, a remembrance of spring water from hidden streams and fruits that tasted like sunlight. Columbus noticed how their voices had deepened, not in pitch, but in patience, their words fewer and fuller, as if shaped by reflection and softened by presence, the kind of presence that sees not with eyes, but with awareness. At night, the stars unfolded across the sky with a clarity that stole the breath. The same constellations they had followed westward now ushered them eastward, yet they seemed changed more familiar. More tender Columbus often lay awake beneath them, arms crossed behind his head, listening to the soft breathing of his men and the creak of the timbers and the language of the waves. The ocean seemed to murmur truths that had no name, only feeling. He found himself revisiting moments, not for their achievement, but for their stillness, the quiet walk beside the stream, the laughter of children beneath mango trees, the way one islander had gently taken his hand and traced a symbol in the sand he remembered. These not as events, but as teachings, as gifts from a place that had expected nothing, and given everything a generosity so simple and profound that it echoed louder than any declaration. The sea at night became a mirror not just of stars, but of the mind, reflecting the journey not as a path of discovery, but as a pilgrimage inward. He felt each mile stretch like a thread, unraveling the tapestry of ambition, revealing instead the delicate stitching of humility and awe, as if each wave gently untangled knots within his spirit, allowing space for softness and reverence to settle in. One evening, as the sun dropped slowly into the horizon, Columbus stood alone at the stern, the wind soft against his face, and he whispered a prayer, not of conquest, but of clarity, not for triumph, but for the strength to hold on to what he had felt here, to not let the world he returned to erase what the journey had taught him. He hoped that silence could survive noise, that wonder could survive explanation. He imagined the faces waiting for him in Castile, the questions, the expectations, the eager hunger for tales of riches and dominion, and he felt a tremor in his chest, not of fear, but of sorrow, for he knew what he carried was not treasure in the way they understood, but something infinitely more fragile and rare, a story made not of gold, but of glances of stillness of trees and stars and wind. He looked once more at his men, and saw in their eyes the same quiet knowing, and he felt comfort in their shared silence. They had all seen the same stars, all tasted the same fruit, all breathed the same stillness, and that would bind them long after their sails were furled, and the ship was anchored once again, and maybe, just maybe, those shared moments would find root in other stories and other lives. As the coastline of Europe slowly approached, Columbus remained at the prow, eyes fixed on the growing horizon. He inhaled the salt air and let it settle into his bones, anchoring himself, not to the land ahead, but to the sea behind the one that had carried him, not only to another world, but to another way of seeing and in. That breath he made a promise to remember not just what he saw, but how he saw it. And as the ship pressed forward over the calm and endless water, he stood still with the weight of memory. The grace of experience and the quiet hope that what he had touched would live on, not in stories of conquest, but in the hearts of those willing to listen to the ocean's gentlest song. He stood not as a hero, but as a student humbled by distance, moved by silence, and awakened by awe. The days after the first meeting passed with a gentle rhythm, as the crew adjusted to the warm breeze and steady light of the islands where time seemed to move not by the ticking of clocks, but by the sway of trees and the shift of shadows on the earth. And in that slowness Christopher found himself reflecting on what had truly been discovered, not gold nor riches, nor kingdoms, but something quieter, something more enduring, a sense of contact that required no conquest, and understanding that needed no declaration. He walked each morning along the edges of the settlement, tracing the impressions left by waves and footprints, considering how strange it felt to be in a place so new and yet feel echoes of something ancient, something in the way the people moved in harmony with the land, in the way children played without fear, in the way elders sat still and silent, yet somehow deeply present the kind of presence that reminded him of the sea itself, vast and unknowable, and filled with its own wisdom. As the crew settled into a routine, Christopher noticed the changes in them. Their shoulders no longer taut with anticipation, their eyes softer, their voices quieter. Meals were shared, not with the rush of labor, but with long pauses and thoughtful glances over unfamiliar fruits and stews. The men sat on logs and stones in circles, talking less and listening more, as though they too had begun to hear. The music of this new world, a song that played between the wind and the branches and inside each breath. In these quiet hours, Columbus began to write in his journal more slowly, more carefully, not the hurried accounts of winds and headings, but long sentences filled with wonder and observation. He described the islanders, not as subjects, but as people with customs and joys, with beauty and intelligence. He wrote not just of the forests and animals, but of how it felt to walk through them, how the sunlight fell through the leaves like golden water, how the ground gave slightly under each step soft as memory. He found himself watching the faces of the people he had met, not to assess them, but to learn from them how they watched one another, how they moved without urgency, how they paused often to touch the earth, or greet a bird, or laugh with a child. These small gestures seemed to Christopher like prayers wordless and sacred. He began to realize how much his world had been shaped by need, by speed, by ambition, and how little space he had left for wonder until now. In one quiet evening, as the sun dipped behind the trees and the sky turned soft with pink and lavender, he stood beside a shallow stream, his reflection broken gently by the current, and he thought of his childhood of Genoa, of narrow streets and salty winds of maps, drawn by candlelight, and of a boy who dreamed not of glory, but of the horizon it struck him. How far that boy had traveled, and yet how little he truly knew. And he let the water carry that thought downstream like a message never meant to return. As the crew began gathering small items found or gifted from the island, Columbus noticed how their hands lingered longer on each object, how they wrapped them not as trophies, but as keepsake stones that glinted like the moon bark with patterns, like constellations fabrics woven in colors so rich they seemed to hum. The men spoke little, but their movements were careful and reverent, and Christopher felt something shift inside him, something less certain, something more open. He began to question what this journey had meant, what it was meant to become, whether the idea of discovery was ever truly about the land, or if it was always about the self, about peeling back the layers of belief and fear and ambition to arrive at something more raw and more human. He did not speak these thoughts aloud, but he felt them, quietly shaping the way he looked at each tree, each bird, each person, and himself. Night after night, the stars appeared with astonishing clarity, bright enough to read by hand. Christopher often lay awake beneath them, tracing old constellations with his finger, naming the ones he knew, and inventing stories for the ones he didn't. The sky was different here, more open somehow, and in it he felt both small and held, as though the universe had placed him gently in the palm of something greater. And for the first time, he did not try to explain it. He simply allowed himself to feel. The quiet days stretched onward, and with them came a peace that Christopher had never known, not the peace of completion, but the peace of being the kind that arrives, not when all is done, but when nothing more needs to be done, when you can simply sit and be, and breathe, and listen. And so he did, sitting under trees, beside streams, beside strangers who had become friends not through words, but through time shared in silence. He no longer needed the constant charting of days, or the lists of tasks, or the weight of decisions. He allowed himself to be guided by the softness of the wind by the way a bird's call echoed, or a child's laughter lingered. He began to believe that perhaps the greatest discovery was not a land, not a people, not a sea route, but a way of seeing that had long been lost, and in the quiet moments of each day, he let that vision settle inside him like a seed. Columbus kept walking, always slowly, always alone in the mornings, now with bare feet feeling the cool touch of the earth and the wet grass and the uneven stones, and with each step he felt less like a captain and more like a man, just a man with questions and wonder and hope. The sky did not change for him, nor did the sea, but he had changed, and that was enough. And as he walked, he began to notice the details again, the colors of bark, the songs of frogs, the way dew caught in a spider's web. One morning an elder from the village approached him and sat beside him without a word for a long time. They watched the trees sway and the smoke rise from cooking fires, and then the elder placed a hand on the earth, and then on his heart, and Christopher did the same. And in that silent gesture, he understood more than any translator could explain that the earth and the heart were not separate, that they beat together, and that to forget one was to lose the other. He carried that understanding with him, back to the ship, back to the crew, and he spoke more, softly, more gently, with fewer words and greater care, and the men listened not out of duty, but because his voice had become quiet enough to hear what mattered, and when he looked at them, he saw not sailors or subjects, but companions on a path that none of them fully understood, and in that uncertainty there was peace. As the sails fold and the winds hush their whispering voices, you are left floating gently in the stillness between the sea and sky, held in a quiet space, where time stretches and softens and all urgency dissolves like mist at sunrise. The rhythm of the journey now behind you pulses faintly in your thoughts, like the tide touching the shore in slow and steady breaths. The hum of memory echoes softly within you with each breath you take. In this soft moment, you are not only listening to a story, you are resting within it, carried by the voice that has moved gently from port to port, from childhood dreams to foreign lands, and back again to the heart. The words are no longer only about history. They are ripples across your own inner waters, lulling the waves of your mind into calm, surrounding you with the presence of each scene. With every image that floated past sails, unfurling stars, shimmering voices, murmuring from distant shores, you've allowed yourself to slow down, to settle, to sink gently into a space of reflection and stillness. The journey of Columbus may be filled with storms and ambitions, with vast oceans and unknown horizons, but here and now, all of that becomes part of your quiet inner voyage, a voyage shaped by breath and softness. Let the memory of salt air and glowing constellations linger around you like a soft blanket. Let the hush of the waves be the only sound you need now, and allow the light of the moon, imagined or remembered, to cast its silver calm across the waters of your awareness, your body resting your breath, flowing your mind unfurling gently into sleep. You do not need to carry the weight of the entire world. You do not need to understand all the currents or map all the stars, for tonight it is enough to simply float, to simply breathe, to simply be, and that simple being is more than enough in this sacred space of silence. And if thoughts drift in like distant sails on the horizon, acknowledge them gently, and let them pass, allowing your breath to remain the anchor that keeps you steady, the voice that tells you that here in this moment you are safe, you are still, you are held, and the sea itself cradles you in its rhythm. You have followed a path across oceans and time, across longing and discovery, across hopes that soared and fears that whispered. Now, let all of that soften, let the sails lower, and the anchor drop into the sea of dreams. You are home within yourself. May your sleep be deep and undisturbed, your rest long and replenishing, and when you wake, may you carry with you a sense of quiet wonder and a heart more open to the stories waiting to be heard, stories that whisper not with urgency, but with presence. Thank you for being here, for allowing this journey to become a part of your evening. May you continue to explore with curiosity, to listen with tenderness, and to rest with ease, because the world needs more calm, more stillness, more awareness. Until we meet again under starlit skies and quiet tides, sleep well and dream gently. You are not alone on this voyage. You are carried by breath and story and space. Allow your thoughts to stretch like a horizon, slowly opening wide and welcoming the peaceful dark between stars. Let yourself dissolve into it, not with fear, but with comfort, with softness. You may hear the whisper of sails folding, the echo of footsteps on wet wood, the hush of quiet winds crossing quiet waters. Feel them not as memories, but as lullabies, carried gently by time. There is nothing left to do now, but rest, to lean into the quiet, to surrender to the rhythm that now lives within you, this gentle rhythm of the sea of memory, of story. Let yourself drift now, unburdened, free, weightless, and serene, your spirit riding soft on tides of breath, rocking with the world and its calm, unwavering pulse. This is the close of the chapter, the soft ending of the day, and as the night deepens around, you know that you are deeply held by silence and stillness and the gentle song of the sea. Sleep well, dear traveler. Let the stars watch over you and the wind carry your dreams safely home.